Yo guys, welcome back to a brand new video where today we are going to take a look at the lightning variant of the Strafe Impale Demon Hunter for Season 27. When I had made my previous guide for the fire variant of the Strafe Impale Demon Hunter, a few people had commented that the lightning version is better. At the time that I was making that video, I didn't even really know that there was a lightning variant out there, and it seems like kind of an unordinary build. Having said that, I've tested it out and I think it's really good. It's definitely faster for getting Paragon levels and pushing through those medium high grader rifts around level 120. Let's go ahead and dive into some of the pros and cons about this build to see if this is something that you're ready to make or if you're even interested in it. For this video, I'm going to start with the cons. The first con, and this is a pretty big one, you'll notice that I don't have shadow power on my bar. If we look at the 4-piece set bonus for the Shadow set, Shadow Power gains the effect of every rune and lasts forever. It's really unfortunate that this build does not take advantage of it, but I can understand why, and we'll get into that in a bit. Next up on the cons is this build is squishy. You are going to have to be at least Paragon 1500. I would almost recommend Paragon 2000 and then switch out from Guardians to the Captain Crimson set and give this build a try. The Paragon levels are really going to help you survive with this build, because one thing that Paragon does better than adding damage, it adds a ton of toughness. Another con is that this build requires really optimized gear, and so I wouldn't recommend going straight for this build the moment that you start your season. Next up for the cons is that we lose quite a bit of single target damage. You'll notice that it does take longer to kill Rift Guardians and sometimes certain beefy elites. And the final con is that this build is very reliant on finding elites and killing them. If you get a dry stretch without any elites, the build is going to suffer to some extent. So if you're okay with the cons and you still feel like this might be a build that you're interested in, let's go ahead and dive into some pros. The first pro, and this has a big advantage over the fire variant, is that we have really good discipline management. A lot of people complain that discipline is difficult to manage with the fire variant, and this version gives us a ton of discipline to work with. The build is also very fast moving, at least while you're using your smokescreen ability. When you're not using the smokescreen ability, you're actually moving slower than the fire variant because you don't have the shadow power that's lasting forever that is giving you a movement speed buff. The next pro is that this build looks very satisfying and it clears screens really quickly. It is also a fantastic build for farming Paragon levels, probably even better than the fire variant. And lastly for the pros is that this build has great mobility. You're going to be moving around with Strafe while also throwing out your Impales, and you're never really stuck in place. Let's go ahead and dive into some gear. First up is the Shadow Set Mask. These are the correct stats that you're going to want. You're going to want that dexterity, crit hit chance, strafe damage, and a socket. One unusual thing about this build is that I am opting to put a topaz in the helm as opposed to a diamond. I got this build from a YouTuber called Saluter. I'll go ahead and leave a link to his video down below because he gets full credit for this build. It was his recommendation to put the topaz in the helm, and we can get away with it because we are using an In-Geom, and we are still going to be able to keep up Vengeance at least 90% of the time, if not all the time. Next up for the shoulders, we're going to be using the Shadow set. You do want these stats. You want the dexterity, area damage, cooldown, and resource cost reduction. Moving on to the amulet, we're using a Squirts necklace. These again are the correct stats that you're going to want. You're going to want the lightning damage, the crit hit damage, crit hit chance, and the socket. I just got this one today, which kind of inspired me to try this build. I will say that hopefully you can get one with a higher crit hit damage roll. Alright, so next up are the gloves. Again, we're using the Shadow set here. These are the stats that you're going to want: the crit hit chance, crit hit damage, area damage, and especially cooldown reduction. This build is very dependent on hitting a certain cooldown threshold because we are not using the Dawn in the Cube anymore. Quadfecta gloves are very hard to come by, and so what I would recommend is that you should at least go for trifecta gloves, and I would take your main stat, crit hit chance, crit hit damage, and cooldown instead of area damage. Moving on to the chest, these are again the stats that you're going to want: the dexterity, vitality, all resist, and 3 sockets. For the wrist slot, we're going to be using Wraps of Clarity so that we can stay alive. Again, these are the stats that you're going to want: lightning damage, dexterity, vitality, and crit hit chance. For the belt, we're going to be using Captain Crimson's. This build does use a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube, so we're going to be wearing 2 pieces of it so that we can benefit from the 2 and 3 piece set. These are going to be the stats that you want on it. You're going to want the dexterity, vitality, all resist, and percent life or armor. Let's go ahead and cover the Captain Crimson's pants. Again, these are the stats you're going to want: dexterity, vitality, all resist, 2 sockets. I do recommend for the chest and the leggings that you go with the diamonds. Although it's nice to stack more dexterity for a little bit of additional damage, this build is especially squishy. Moving on to the rest of the jewelry, we have the focus and restraint combo. This focus is not exactly perfect. This is a fine roll, and it's easier to get one with dexterity, crit hit chance, crit hit damage, and a socket. However, if you can, it is okay to roll off the dexterity for either cooldown reduction or average damage, depending on which one you need. For my restraint here, I went ahead and took the cooldown reduction. We've also got the classic 3 trifecta stats for the ring: crit hit chance, crit hit damage, and a socket. Our final piece for the shadow set is going to be the boots. Now, it is okay if you want to use the Captain Crimson's boots and then instead use the Shadow's leggings. I would recommend going whichever way you get better stats from. For these boots though, we are absolutely going to want that Impale damage percent, and I would also recommend the dexterity, vitality, and all resist. Okay, so for the quiver, we're going to be using the Holy Point shot. This piece is very difficult to roll well, and for this reason, I probably recommend that you use your Angelic Crucible here. Make sure that you're getting the ability where Strafe casts the last non-channeled hatred spending ability. These are the stats that you're going to want: the lightning, dexterity, crit hit chance, attack speed, and impale damage. I got incredibly lucky today. I was ready to throw down about 300 to 400 Angelic Crucibles to get this to roll correctly. It took a ton of them to get my fire one rolled just like this. I probably used about 200 Angelic Crucibles. Today, for this one, I only had to use 2. This was my second roll, and I was in total shock. And lastly is the weapon, and this is a really odd choice. The build typically uses the Carlay's Point with the Dawn in the cube because we want the impale damage and we want permanent uptime on Vengeance. One of the cool things about this build is you'll notice that my primal Carlay's Point is a 4.5% damage loss on the In-Geom. They're both primal pieces with 10% additional damage rolled on them, and you'll notice that In-Geom can get up to a higher max damage of 1940. Although this makes it more difficult to keep up your Vengeance all the time, it is a pretty large damage increase. For the In-Geom, these are going to be the stats that you want. You want that 10% increase to damage, you want the area damage, and you want cooldown reduction. Once again, if you can't get one with all these stats, I would probably recommend rolling off the area damage and prioritizing the cooldown reduction and taking whichever other stat that you can roll that's at least feasible. Okay, for our gems, I'm using a Bane of the Trapped here, a Taeguk, and a Zaystone of Vengeance. One quick note on the Zaystone of Vengeance is it is a gem that is much better than it actually reads in game. I'll go ahead and drop a link down below to the video I made on the Zaystone of Vengeance that kind of covers how it actually works. Okay, moving on to the skills and passives. We're going to be using Bolas with Freezing Strike. The only reason that we use this is that we need a generator to proc half of the Focus Restraint combo. This is a nice choice to take for your primary skill because it shoots out 3 Bolas and they have a pretty good distance. To proc half of the Focus and Restraint combo, we do have to connect with an enemy, and this is a very useful skill for easily connecting with enemies by just kind of shooting it off in a random direction. Next up is Strafe with Drifting Shadow. We're going to be strafing 100% of the time. We take the Drifting Shadow rune so that we can move faster. As mentioned before, this is a lightning build, so we're going to be taking Impale with Ricochet. Now, do bear in mind with Ricochet that your first shot, the first enemy that you're going to hit, is going to take 75,000% increased damage because of the 6-piece bonus on the set. The ricochet off of it that hits additional enemies is only going to get a 25,000% damage bonus. This is still significant, but make sure that you're focusing on the targets that are beefier and the ricochet effects will kill everything else around it. One last note on the ricochet is that it is pretty nice. It can jump to 2 additional enemies within 20 yards away from each other, which is a pretty decent distance. Next up is we're using smokescreen with displacement. This is different than the fire build. With the fire build, we use the special recipe rune because it costs much less discipline. With displacement, it's going to cost 14 discipline as opposed to 8. The upside to this is that we gain massive increased movement speed. I'll go ahead and demonstrate real quick. We are moving crazy fast when this is up. Now, although the discipline may seem alarming, we're using preparation with focus mind. This rune is fantastic. It's going to give us 45 discipline over 15 seconds. Because we're using the In-Geom with this build, we are going to have this cooldown up pretty frequently as long as we're running into elites. This will absolutely allow us to spam the smokescreen ability. Lastly, for the skills is Vengeance with Dark Heart. This is pretty standard. It's going to reduce the damage that we take by a lot. It is also going to add to the damage that we deal. If you're playing the build correctly, and as long as you're hitting enough elites in your Greater Rift, you should be able to keep this up the vast majority of the time. I will admit though, sometimes it does drop off and there's not really anything you can do about it if you're not hitting enough elites. This is another reason why the build is a little squishy, because when this drops off, you are super vulnerable, and that's another reason that I recommend you get a higher Paragon before even attempting this build. Moving on to the passives, we're going to be using Tactical Advantage. This is just going to give us more movement speed when we cast our smokescreen. For the next one, we're using Thrill of the Hunt. This is mostly to allow us to slow the enemies, and so then we can proc the Bane of the Trapped ability. Whenever we hit them, we're getting that increased damage. We're also going to be using Ambush, which is pretty standard. This is really nice with this build because we do a lot of damage to the first target that we hit, and it's going to be amplified by a bunch for our first hit. This passive is super important and is one of the reasons that we can one-shot a lot of enemies as we're moving through a rift. Now for the last one, I would recommend Call of the Week if you're at least Paragon 3000 and you're not dying that often, you don't feel quite as squishy. For lower Paragons, I would recommend going with Awareness. Having an extra life with this build can really reduce the frustration of dying all the time. If you're not into that, and if for some reason you're having discipline issues, perhaps you can't get enough resource cost reduction to make this build work, but you still want to try it, I would recommend going with Blood Vengeance because this will help you keep up your discipline. Okay, so moving on to the cube, we're going to be using the Carle's Point in the cube. Of course we need this in the cube because we are not using it, and our build is entirely dependent on this weapon. Next up is the Mantle of Channeling. We're pretty much strafing all the time, and so we just get a 25% damage reduction and 25% increased damage bonus. And of course we need the Ring of Royal Grandeur so that we can make the Captain Crimson set work as well as the Shadow set work while they're both missing one piece. Okay, so let's talk about the follower. This build absolutely needs an Enchantress with 25,000 intelligence at a minimum. All of her abilities do cap out at that 25,000, and what we really need is the 10% extra cooldown reduction for this build. This is very helpful for both managing our discipline by using more preparations and also allowing us to keep up the Vengeance more often. Now I know that my face is blocking some of these abilities, but I'm going to go over each one of them so you can set up your Enchantress the same way. To start, I recommend taking Temporal Pulse. You should absolutely also be taking Prophetic Harmony unless you have somehow managed to get at least 50% cooldown reduction without the Enchantress. If that's the case, you could go with the Amplification skill instead. For the next skill on the Enchantress, Powered Shield is my choice. I mostly just take this for survivability. However, if you're doing fine with survivability and you don't feel like you need it, you could alternatively take Erosion for the additional damage. And the last skills on the Enchantress are the same thing. You can take the Focused Mind if you want to do more damage. Focused Mind will give you a 6% boost to your attack speed. I personally take Fate's Lapse. Because I'm opting not to use Awareness in my passives, I need some kind of ability that is going to give me a free life. So ultimately with the Enchantress, I would really just recommend taking whatever skills are going to work best for you based on your survivability and based on your damage. The most important skill that you should probably absolutely take though is the Prophetic Harmony for the cooldown reduction. For her gear, there is a few essential pieces that we'll cover real quick. You're going to want her to have the Ice Climbers so that she is immune to the immobilizing and freezing effects. You're going to want an Oculus Ring. This is such an important part of the build for pretty much any follower. Make sure that you're always trying to stand in these pools whenever possible so that you can get the increased damage bonus. The next essential piece is going to be the Nemesis Bracers. These are a classic for followers as well. Make sure that you're taking these so that you get extra elites throughout your greater rifts. And the last one, of course, is going to be the Flavor of Time so that we get double duration on the pylon effects. I like taking the Smoking Thurible for the focus. If your Enchantress is strong enough and she's not dying while you're doing your speed farming, you could absolutely go with the focus that's going to unlock all of her skills. Ultimately, just make sure that she's got that 25,000 intelligence and that she can stay alive one way or the other. So moving on, I'm going to put some clips of gameplay that I have had with this build. I've probably only done about 8 or 9 runs with it so far, but I did want to get a video out because I could instantly tell that this is faster than the Fire version. As a reminder though, this build is far more reliant on your gear than the Fire variant. So I would recommend that you start your season with the Fire variant, using the Guardian set, and then transitioning to this around Paragon 2000 where you switch into the Captain Crimson set. Let's go ahead and dive into some of the gameplay. Alright, so that's going to do it for the gameplay section. I hope that you really enjoy this build. Hopefully you get the chance to optimize your gear enough this season to give it a shot. If you have any tips or tricks for players that were not mentioned during this video, go ahead and drop a comment down below and let us know. As always, folks, I truly appreciate you for stopping by. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.